Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more automation, the Car Company Tycoon game, continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison Car Company in 1991. Now, the model we're going to be looking at in this video is the Edison Satellite, which is our economical sports car, and it will be the last of the performance vehicles in the company's lineup. We've already finished the Comet, which is our quote-unquote true sports car. This is our more economy-based sports car, trying to be more on the cheap side. I only have a few different trims here to look at, and we'll start off with the base trim. Now, the base trim is going to start off, and let's start with our model here, with a 2.2-liter engine, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. Now, the body I end up choosing is going to give me a penalty for the desirability, just as we had with the Comet, and that's just having to choose which body I think is appropriate. I'm trying to build this, kind of around a MR2, at least an idea. I'm not trying to copy it exactly. And, this looks pretty similar to the way the MR2 looks, maybe more in the 80s than in the 90s, but still, I don't know if this look is really all that dated by 1991, but yet it's giving us a pretty, well, even more of a penalty than it did with the Comet body. So, again, I'm not really a big fan of that, but let's move along. So monocoque is our only choice. Corrosion-resistant steel is what the chassis is going to be made out of. We have a mid-transverse mount, and I did notice that there's now rear-mounted engines available for some bodies. We have McPherson strut in the front and McPherson strut in the rear. Now, the reason I did that is to keep costs low and weight low. So we could have gotten a little better drivability and sportiness out of this vehicle if I had gone with double wishbone, but it would have cost us more and weighed more. And then I went with polymer body panel. Now, this is going to lower our safety and prestige, but it's going to also lower our weight, which is one thing that I wanted to focus on. Now, as far as the styling goes, and I forgot to put badges on a couple of the trims, and actually we're going to have to go to this one to do that, so why don't I go ahead and jump in. So only one of the trims actually has the badges, and the main reason for that is the badges were glitching out on me when I was first building these, so I want one roughly here. And I want another one in the rear. There is going to be another trim that is missing the badges, but we'll try and fix that if we remember. Okay, so as far as I was saying, styling-wise, now you'll notice that the wheel arches here are way pulled out. And that was to just make the tire diameters what I considered to be realistic for the kind of car we were going for and the time period. And to do that, you have to have these ridiculous wheel arches. That's another thing that I'm sometimes not a big fan of, is that the allowance for your wheel widths are not very much for the way the body is styled normally. In any case, let's go ahead and look at that engine I was talking about. So we have the 2.2-liter high output version of this engine, and I just want to hop right into the performance so we get an idea. So this is producing 122 horsepower and 126 foot-pounds of torque. And as I stated when I was building this engine, I wish I could have got a little bit more power out of this engine than I did. And I probably could have, but I would have really suffered as far as economy numbers go. But it's definitely a choice I could have done. And if I were to be frank with you, maybe I should have. But let's go ahead and look at the trim here. So gearbox first. Now, 5-speed manual. This being the base trim is going to have a manual transmission. I will have an automatic transmission version of this that we'll look at later. So the way I set up my gearbox here is the fifth gear does go a little bit into an economy gear, but not very much. And the reason why is I wanted to really try and get the best 0 to 62 times we could. And seeing how I wasn't really having to deal with wheel spin, I went with as aggressive as I could before we started having wheel spin. So you'll note if I start going with the spacing, I still don't even have any wheel spin, but it actually gets to a point where, oh, you know what? I guess I was wrong on that. When I was initially building this, yeah, see there, you reach a point where you end up actually being worse off for making the gearbox a little bit more aggressive, but it looks like we can get a little bit better time out of this by being a little bit more aggressive than my initial setup. Maybe little tweaks here and there have changed some dynamics about the car. So we got it down a little bit quicker as far as the 0 to 62 time, which is good. And we still don't have any wheel spin, so that's also good. Now, as far as the tire diameter goes, I went with 175 millimeter width in the front and 225 in the rear, which I think is a perfectly reasonable setup for this type of car and this time period. We have 15-inch rims, alloy, and the rim design that I went with is this one here. I would like one that isn't so spindly with very little like spindles or spokes, I guess you would say, because most of these are just like, I think they're far too modern. I would like to see maybe some more, I guess, conservative choices. Maybe this design, but not nearly as spindly as I said. The spokes maybe a little bit wider. And I went with medium road compound road. Now, I could have gone with sports compound road, and there's no reason that I maybe shouldn't. Let's see what happens if we do. You know, I may end up taking it because we're trying to go with more of a performance-oriented vehicle here. Or maybe I won't. Maybe not with the base trim. I'll stick with medium compound road, and I think we'll make a change later that I forgot to make when I was making this car originally that I think will help us a lot when we get to some of the other trims, or at least one of the other trims. All right, moving along. Now, to keep things cheap, I actually went outside the norm of what I usually do, and I went with single piston both front and rear for the solid disc brakes. And that might be something that I start doing a lot more in the future rather than continue to do two piston brakes. And there was a reason I was doing that. I think I'm going to start switching to the one piston brakes to try and keep costs low on the cars that are really not meant to be all that expensive and performance oriented. But in case we don't have any brake fade to worry about, this is a pretty lightweight car, and the brake size is, pretty well balanced or maximized. But even just adjustment a little bit in the rear, we start to have brake fade. So the size that I have here and in the front is pretty much, if I also decrease here, you'll note that we're still having brake fade. So this is exactly where we want to be in the ideal. You don't want any bigger than this because that won't do any good, and we don't have any brake fade, so anymore we won't really get a benefit, but we will have the cost of more money and more weight. So there's no reason to have bigger brakes than you require. For cooling airflow, I usually go about 10 above what I'm required to have. And we have a fully clad under tray and then no wing angle because there is no winging. And it seems like this is now behaving as it should. If you don't have a wing, then you can't actually do anything with this. So if I switch this wing angle around, there should be no change because I don't have a wing, which makes perfect sense. Moving along, as far as the interior choices, we have the 2 seats standard, and I went with standard cassette and also power steering and ABS and standard safety. Now, the suspension setup, I went with standard gas monotube and passive sway bars. And as I usually do, I went off of the normal preset. But just as with the Comet, required me quite a lot of tweaking from that normal preset. I wasn't, I didn't really feel like that the normal preset was too close to what we wanted. So there was a lot of tweaking, a lot of that being stiffening of the suspension and the spring stiffness, a big amount, especially the front springs here. And the damper stiffness as well. I believe I changed the camber as well. It wasn't quite as negative as it is now. And the sway bar stiffness as well was also stiffened. And then the ride height was brought down pretty significantly. As per usual, I like to go to the point where we're just above the bottom out. At least if I'm building a more performance-oriented vehicle, that's for sure what I'm going to do. And even then, if I'm not, oftentimes I'll do that. All that being said, let's go ahead and look at our detailed stats. So we have drivability. We have sportiness. We have comfort, prestige, and finally safety. And as per usual, if you want to look at any of that in more detail, just go ahead and pause your screen. I'm giving you guys a few seconds to do that if you would wish. Let's get to the appropriate track here. So top speed comes in at 131.3 miles an hour. And our acceleration, as you saw earlier, is at 7.9 seconds from 0 to 62. Cornering G, I tried to make it handle decently, tried to bring down that roll angle and everything. Let's see what we get. From what I remember, it's pretty respectable for how much power we're toting. So a 1 minute 39.07. Not bad. Not bad at all. So let's go ahead and jump into our next trim. And this is just going to be the automatic version of this trim. So there's not going to be really much choices outside of the gearbox. And I'll show you the market stuff at the very end. So this is another example of a trim that didn't get the badges. The two standard trims are the ones that kind of missed out on that. Yeah, and there's the bug. You guys can't see the bug, but for some reason when I'm switching in between trims, I get a bug when I try and select the badge, and it doesn't allow me to do it. And you'll probably be able to see the badge isn't behaving itself. It should only be a single badge. And if I were to place this, I can't even place it. It just bugs out. And I possibly just crashed the game. All right, so I just crashed the game. I'll be back in a second. Okay, and we're back, and I was able to get the badges on this time. I don't know what it is. It seems like if I add the badge in one trim, and then I switch to another trim and then try and add the badge to that trim, it gives me some kind of bug where the badge doesn't want to load in properly. And the only way it seems to work again is if I close the game and reopen it. In this case, I didn't have a choice because the game just totally crashed. But let's go ahead and look at the trim here. So we're going to start with the gearbox. Now, the gearbox, being an automatic transmission, being the main difference, is a 4-speed automatic rather than a 5-speed manual. And there has to be a lot of changes as a result. So I tried to make this thing a lot more aggressive, so we don't really have this set up more for economy at all. And I tried to make it as aggressive as I could with what wheel spin I think I had. Yeah. So without getting any wheel spin, the best I can get out of this is 8.8 seconds. And you're going to see that. You're going to have a pretty massive penalty whenever you switch to an automatic transmission. One could argue maybe too much of a penalty. In any case, let's go ahead and go down the line. So nothing's really changed with the tire setup. And one thing I guess I didn't point out before is the wheel diameter I also brought down from your normal default presets. Brakes are going to be set up the same as they were before. Now, aerodynamics are also going to be the same, as is the interior setup. Suspension is also the same. And let's go ahead and look at our detailed stats. So we've got drivability, sportiness, comfort, prestige, and finally safety. All right, let's hop into the test track here. Now, we did drop a little bit in top speed, 128.9 miles an hour, which makes sense because we set up the gearbox a little bit differently. And we're also going to have to reselect the airfield track as, the game was reopened, so it's always going to go to the automation track as default. We already talked about the 0 to 62 time. Cornering G's, from what I remember, is roughly about the same. I don't know about the speeds in the corners. But let's go ahead and look at the time. Now, it's obviously going to be slower, as we can see here, 1 minute 41.29, so it's more than, 2 seconds? Because the other one was 1:39 and just a little bit, like 0.07, if I remember correctly, so more than 2 seconds difference, and that's going to, a lot of that's going to come down to the acceleration time. That's oftentimes key when you are doing your track runs. Top speed's going to affect it a little bit, but the acceleration is going to be the big element there. Okay, that being said, let's go ahead and hop into our last trim, which is the 1.6T, which utilizes a different engine, the 1.6-liter turbocharged engine. I also have a little bit visually difference with this car in that I added on a wing. Before we get into that, though, let's go ahead and hop in and look at the engine. So this is a turbocharged 1.6-liter engine, so it's smaller in displacement, and it ends up with 153 horsepower and 150 foot-pounds of torque. Now, that is definitely an improvement over our other engine, but I'm not so sure I was so happy with this engine. Honestly, I think if I had either gone with the same displacement or slightly less and not made as aggressive of a turbocharged engine, it probably would have been better, both performance-wise and not being so aggressive and hard to handle from a drivability standpoint, which we'll see a little bit later. But I was concerned about size limits because the turbocharger is, does take up space, I guess is what I want to say there, and what have you. So let's go ahead and hop into the design of this. Now, there is going to be a couple changes I make to this kind of on the fly that we'll go over, but this is still a 5-speed manual transmission. Matter of fact, I think I'm going to make that change now. So rather than have it with a medium compound road, I think it's more appropriate for a sports compound road because this is supposed to be a little bit more aggressive in setup. So we're going to gain a decent amount in drivability and sportiness, but one thing I'm really looking for is to get this wheel spin down. So maybe we can set up the gearbox a little bit more aggressively here with the spacing and get our 0 to 62 time down a little bit. There we go. So we got to 7.4 seconds, which I'm pretty happy with. And we don't have any wheel spin to contend with either. And this I set up much more for economy than I did the other engine. And the main reason I did that is because the engine itself is not nearly as economical as the 2.2-liter engine. As we can see here, we're only getting 22 miles per gallon, whereas before I think we were getting somewhere around 25. Okay, so let's hop back into this. So the tire width and diameter and everything is going to be the same. But I did just upgrade to sports compound road. As I said, I'm trying to go with a much more performance-oriented setup with this trim. As a result, I also upgraded the brakes. So the brakes are 2-piston, both front and rear, as well as having a little bit more aggressive pad type. We end up with 0 brake fade, even though there's more demands on this. On the brakes, we were able to get rid of that brake fade with the more aggressive pad type. Now, cooling airflow, we're going to require more as a result of the engine requiring more. But another thing I'd like to point out is, although I didn't do anything with the wing angle, just having the wing seems to have changed the dynamics of the downforce in the rear. So before, if you remember from the graph we had before, this blue line, which represents the rear, was very similar to the line for the front. Well, now, just by adding that wing, it's much different. And as I said, I could increase this with the wing angle. You note the downforce becomes stronger and stronger. But I'm pretty happy with what downforce we already have. And I'm not seeing that big of a benefit. Honestly, what we're going to end up doing is robbing ourselves of top speed, robbing ourselves of economy, because we have more drag going on. We might handle a little bit better, which we do notice a little bit of a bonus in the sportiness, but we're going to suffer in a lot of other categories. Prestige, because we're dropping that top speed down. Sportiness we're getting because, as I said, handling is going to be a little bit better. And drivability, I'm not exactly sure why we're getting a negative. But as I said, we're already getting downforce just without any wing angle adjustments at all. So I think we're perfectly fine. Now, the interior didn't change at all for this vehicle. And that's kind of the dynamic that I've always done. So although this is upgraded as far as performance, it's not upgraded as far as its interior. Now, the suspension is going to have quite a bit of differences, although it is kind of in the same vein. And we might actually be able to get away with a little bit more reduction in ride height. There we go. So I think actually this is probably very, very similar, but maybe just a slight differences here and there. And a lot of that is because the engines and the two engines are pretty much the same weight, and we'll see that a little bit later. And you have to think about the fact that although the cars might weigh very similarly, we've upgraded this vehicle quite a bit with, heavier brakes and things like that that technically should have made this car even more heavy than the other trims. But we'll look at that when we look at the comparisons. Okay, all that being said, let's go ahead and look at our detailed stats now. So we're going to have drivability. And the one thing I want to point out here is the engine penalty we get. And this is because of how aggressive that engine is set up. Just like with what we had with the Comet with the turbocharged engine there. You get a benefit in performance, but we suffer quite a bit in drivability because we get a pretty massive penalty because of how aggressively set up that engine is. I mean, if you look at the gearbox setup, this is not by any means the straight line that you'll get with a naturally aspirated engine. Now, if we had made this not quite so aggressive with that turbocharger, this wouldn't be so severe, and as a result, we wouldn't have so much of a penalty. If I remember correctly, this penalty we're getting to drivability might actually be more severe than the penalty we got with the Comet, but I can't be for certain on that. We have sportiness, comfort, prestige, and finally, safety. Okay, let's go ahead and look at our test track. Now, we get a little bit more top speed, 138.1 miles an hour. Now, I'm wondering if that wing is adjusting this number so that if we hadn't had it, maybe we would have more top speed than what we got with our 2.2 manual trim. But it's still more. I just wonder if it would have been much more, or at least more of a significant change. Now, 0 to 62 time, we chopped off about a half a second. Now, we only gained about 30 horsepower from one engine to the other. So I think you can come to expect a little bit of, that much of a difference. But half a second is going to make a big difference when we actually go to the time, though, as we saw with the difference between the manual and the automatic. Now, as far as the cornering Gs go, if I remember correctly, this is handling better and it's having more speed in the corners, which is exactly what we want to have happen because this is supposed to be the more performance-oriented of all the trims that we have. That being said, let's get cut down to the chase and run our time. All right, so what we ended up with is 1 minute 34.93, which is a pretty significant difference between the 2.2 manual and the 1.6 T or turbocharged. So pretty happy with the track time that we're getting. So all that being said, let's go ahead and look at the market data that we have for each of the trims. So we'll start back with our standard trim with the 2.2 manual. And I have added a 5%, what is the word I want to say, up mark from the price, which is what we're doing with all of our models, just to kind of keep things consistent. Now, the three categories that we do pretty well in are track budget, sports budget, and pony. Now we're not really going for the pony, but sports budget and track budget are exactly the market segments that we're really looking for. Honestly, we're looking more for sport budget than we're looking for track budget, but it looks like we're performing a little bit better in this category as far as our desirability. But you will note that we are getting a penalty of 2% because our body is too old, which is the same penalty we were getting with the Comet. I thought when I was looking at this, okay, it changes depending on what market segment you're looking at. So sports budget's a 3% penalty. With track budget, it's only a 2% penalty. Interesting. So I guess it depends on what market segment you're looking at. But it's still a penalty regardless of what market segment you're looking at. That might be a new change because I don't remember that with the Comet. When I was building the Comet, it seemed like a flat penalty everywhere. But it looks like, depending on where I look, the penalty is different. Any case, just keep in mind that we have that desirability penalty pretty much anywhere we look. It's going to be of some level. It looks like off-road is the only place that we don't have. Off-road budget is the only place we don't have a penalty, and maybe some utility vehicles. Any case, track budget, we perform pretty well, but as far as affordability goes, not very many people in this market segment can afford it. which is kind of a bad thing. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised at that because this vehicle is very much budget oriented. I mean, we do have that 5% up mark, but this is not really all that expensive. And this is one of our cheaper vehicles. And the fact that that's still not a very affordable car in this market segment is kind of interesting. Maybe an element of this is that a track budget car would be very much stripped out, so you wouldn't have any entertainment. You would have basic interior and what have you, and that would drop the cost probably pretty significantly. So that might be a big element of why this isn't as affordable to the track budget crowd. But even with the sports budget crowd, this is not all that affordable. Only 50% of people can afford it, but it does all right as far as desirability. But if we were to look at maybe just sports car in general, we don't do so well. But a lot of people can afford it. Now, Pony, again, we're not really going for this, and I don't really think this vehicle necessarily fits this category all that well, but it's a little bit more affordable for this category. Family Sport is another category where we do decently, and it's pretty affordable in this segment. But I think one of the reasons why we don't score so well is while we only have 2 seats, there's not a whole lot of practicality to this vehicle. So I think that's why we're not doing so well in the Family Sport comparatively. Okay, all that being said, let's go ahead and look at our automatic trim. And you're going to have to expect a little bit of changes here because of the dynamics of the automatic transmission. So let's hop into the market segment here. And I don't think I guess I didn't save the increase in cost for the sales price. But in any case, let's look at what we're looking at now as far as which market segments we are meeting. So we've got sports budget still is our best category, and it's a little bit less affordable, but not a big difference. And I don't remember score-wise if we're doing better in this segment or not. It's very close, I think. Fun premium, not sure how well we would normally fit this category because we don't really have any premium choices, but we do all right in that. And then family sport yet again, but it suffers quite a bit. All right, now let's look at our last trim, which is the 1.6T. Now, I'm going to expect that this is going to meet some of the same market segments, which it does, although it stops meeting family sport as well and moves over to fun premium, which I guess makes a little bit of sense because it is a little bit more expensive. But the thing that I thought would happen, and this is exactly what I'm seeing, is that our affordability has dropped, and I think that's going to cause this desirability to be kind of a problem as well. As that does affect us. I mean, if you look at me adjusting the price here, if I go down to 0, it's much more affordable, and as a result, we're going to also score better in this category, at least if it works the way it has in the past. Oop, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's get it back to 5. So we can see at 5, as opposed to 0, it's quite a bit of a difference. But in any case, let's get back to 5. So we're not scoring as well as we did in the past in the sports budget, nor I think in the track budget. And it's not as affordable as it was in the past. And we're also no longer really doing as well in the pony segment as we did in the past, but we're doing a little bit better in the fun premium. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. Light sport is probably another category outside of the sports budget that we might have been looking for, but it seems like we didn't really score as well as I would have hoped. And it looks like sportiness is a big element of that. And maybe because we didn't go full out for sportiness is why maybe we didn't score as well. But in any case, let's go ahead and look at our comparison now between our different trims and maybe our other performance-oriented model. So as far as things go, the highest sportiness trim is the 1.6T. Makes sense. But comparing it to our Comet, we notice the Comet is a lot more sporty, which is exactly as it should be. But it does come pretty decently close to the automatic trim of the Comet. a couple points off, which is not bad. I honestly am pretty pleased with this vehicle overall. Now, we see with our economy here, we're doing pretty well. I mean, especially if you compare that to, for instance, the Star, which is our midsize family sedan. You can see with our economy, we're pretty much outperforming all of the trims here outside of our standard 2.4 manual. Is comparable to a couple of our trims. The 1.6 T is the worst performer, and it matches a couple of the best performers from the Star. Now, if we were to look at the Luna, though, the Luna is going to be our best performer as far as economy. And this is exactly what I wanted this car to be. I wanted it to be in between what we get out of our Comet and what we get out of our Luna, which I think I did exactly that as far as the economy numbers go, and I'm pretty happy with that. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.